Hello viewers, welcome to sarkaritale.com and diplomacyindia.com. In this very special series, we are going to talk to individuals who have contributed to some outstanding work. Mr. Vinod Daniel, he is the CEO of India Vision Institute. He is also the board member of International Council of Museums, and he is also the chairman of Ausheritage. Vinod has worked in nearly 50 countries on museums. He is also an alumni of IIT Delhi and Madras, and he has an outstanding record of charity work and service in India. To assist me today, I have a very special guest, Ambassador Pradeep Kapur, who is a former diplomat. He was Secretary to Government of India, and he was also Ambassador to Chile and Cambodia. So I welcome Mr. Daniel and Ambassador Kapur to this very special program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me as part of your show.
I'll start with my first question. I asked Mr. Daniel about your very interesting background. You hold a degree in chemical engineering from IIT Delhi and master's degree from IIT Madras. And you also from Texas Christian University, USA. Interestingly, you began your career with preservation first in the US, and then after you made to move to Australia with museums there, and as a long-serving member of the board of the Australia-India Council and the chairman Aussie Heritage, from a training to a chemical engineering to a totally different path. How did you manage this?
Thank you for this opening question. Look, I mean, I think life is a journey, and in the journey, there are certain strands you pick up, and then you just expand on those strands as you go through the journey. As a kid, I was always interested in engineering, and that's very much why I wrote, in those days it was called the joint entrance exam, which I think it's still called now. And I was privileged to get a place in IIT. I wanted to do chemical engineering, and also I wanted to, I'm from Chennai, but I wanted to kind of leave Chennai and see a little more of India. So I put my first preference as Delhi. That taught me a lot of skills in life, just moving from your own comfort zone into a new area. For someone who didn't know any Hindi, to go and learn a bit of Hindi, a whole range of other skill sets along with the education, I got. After that, I did have the privilege of getting a scholarship to go to the US, and I did expand on my chemical background. Then as it happens, sometimes you're fortunate when certain career breaks happen. The Getty Trust, which includes the Getty Museum, they were looking at somebody with a chemical background to do some research as well as advice on how to preserve collections. And I applied for the job, and I was fortunate to get the job. So that kind of opened up one more horizon of the whole museum world. I did go to the Getty in 1990. And one of the first projects I was working on was on how to better preserve the mummies in Egypt. I mean, as a young kid, it was fascinating. We're all fascinated with mummies. And when you get to work with a mummy in your office or in the next laboratory, next to your office, I think it's a phenomenal experience. And I did enjoy the research. I did enjoy the outputs that happen. And also what I really enjoyed was what came out of that was very practical. Museums around the world started using it. The impact of what you do was quite high. And that's when I got an offer for an opportunity in Australia, and I moved from there to the Australian Museum, and I kept broadening my base within the museum sector. Then I was also working internationally quite a lot, and it's great having Ambassador Pradeep Kapur here, because I learned a little bit of diplomacy, as you work, as you travel. And I did work, closely with the Australian government, on a whole range of projects. So I was very fortunate to to get an opportunity to be within one of the boards in Foreign Affairs and Trade. And that's where I met, as I said, sometimes you're fortunate, and I was very fortunate to meet this fantastic gentleman who was doing major eye care around the world. And he was one of the other board members. So we both had this fascination, for doing, exciting new things. But also he had a very strong interest in India. I traveled with him very closely. And that's when we realized that there was a big need for helping people in India, especially underprivileged and people living in rural parts, with access to a pair of spectacles, which is life-changing. Kids can study better, adults can be more productive, they can work better. So right now I kind of juggle both my roles. I do this project pro bono in terms of this charity. We have a big team. We work in more than 18 states in India. The government, everybody has been greatly supportive. And I also work globally, including with museums in India with regard to my heritage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vinod. I see that we belong to the same alma mater, IIT Delhi. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this discussion. And coming to museums, what future do you see for museums? With technological advancement, have come newer ways and forms of leisure and entertainment for people, including virtual museums and so on. Is there any realignment by museums worldwide to face the challenges these pose to the sector as a whole?
Yeah. I think more than a challenge, I'll call it an opportunity. One of the things that COVID has taught is how everybody could embrace technology. See, the traditional museum depended on having collections, having exhibitions, people walking in, paying an entry fee, and going and viewing the exhibition. The audience is a bit of localized, plus a bit of international tourists, and not everyone's got the opportunity to travel somewhere. And one major aspect that is going to happen because of technology is, rather than people coming to the museum, you'll be able to take the museum to the people. And if you can do that in a way that is interactive, that is exciting, that actually, is something the audience want. I mean, you've got a choice of Netflix, you've got a choice of a whole range of other things. Why would you go to a museum online? So if you can actually, look at how to make it exciting, educative, and people would still tune in, I think that's great. And that's a phase that's going on right now. Technology would be a great enabler. The second big issue that's happening now within the museum sector is funding. And as to be expected, COVID has put a squeeze on government budgets, corporate budgets, everybody's budgets. So there is going to be a big push to get new audiences, so that other than people, coming to the gate and paying, and the government providing a subsidy, we need to find new sources of revenue generation. And how do we get people online using virtual platforms, but at the same time, they can actually pay for certain services? I think, both these things would go hand in hand.
Thank you. Ameya?
Mr. Vinod, I would also like to know that you've been also engaged in a noble cause of, helping people in India accessing vision screening and getting them a free pair of free glasses. Can you just tell about this project and how it is going on?
Yeah, I mean, during my early visits to India, I had this great, eye care specialist, Professor Brian Holden from Australia, who sadly passed away a few years back, accompany me. And he has done so much work around the world to focus on one single issue, that people shouldn't be unnecessarily blind because they don't have a pair of spectacles. Now, looking at a place like India, they say over 100 million or over 10 crore Indians at this time would do things better some would be technically blind, but many of them would do things better. Say, for example, you're over 45, you need reading glasses. You don't know that's what you need. I mean, that's what happens in small towns and villages. They can't read even the local language newspaper. They can't do basic things, productively. It takes a lot of effort. If you're a child, 8 to 10% of children would need glasses. You don't have glasses, then you don't see the board well. If you don't see the board well, you don't study well, you don't get good grades, and many of them might drop out or really fare, really badly in studies. So all you need to do in this particular case is, one, make people aware that you get your eyes checked and get a pair of glasses. The cost is not the biggest impediment, but it's one, awareness, second is access. So what we try and do is actually try to get this message across quite strongly. And where access is not that easy, we tend to do camps and then, provide spectacles, as part of the vision screening to anyone who needs. And it's getting, more. I mean, there are more organizations now who are working in this area. And I would imagine at some stage, I mean, the hope is by 2050, it'll be refractive error free. That means anyone who needs access to a pair of spectacles would get access to it.
That brings me to a supplementary question, like how serious is the problem of blindness or visual impairment in India?
See, overall, there are many issues. I think, there are a lot of people who struggle with blindness. The problem is going to get more acute, especially with diabetes becoming a bigger issue. The whole thing on diabetic retinopathy being a big issue. There are issues with glaucoma. There's a whole bunch of other things. Similarly, you look at older people, most of them would need access to a cataract surgery. So blindness is a big issue. But the good part is this has been recognized both by the government, and it'd be great if government, does even more, but also within the NGO sector. There are some pretty fantastic facilities that are coming up. You take facilities like the LV Prasad Institute, Shankar Nethralaya, Arvind, Shroff Charity Hospital and all. And I think they collectively working with the government are making a big difference. Not only that, I think it's also something that's in the minds of some very, prominent people who are household names. Last year, we did a major campaign in UP where Amitabh Bachchan gave his voice, so that it was called the See Now campaign. And he's quite keen to continue the campaign even more, maybe expand that so that he becomes a bit of a voice to say, look, go get your eyes checked. It can be fixed. There are facilities.
If you could share some statistics related to India, to enlighten our viewers.
Yeah, so I'll probably touch more on the uncorrected refractive error space. Within the uncorrected refractive error, that is people who need access to a pair of spectacles. Right now, they say over 10 crore Indians need access to a pair of spectacles, but don't have it. Now, if they don't have access to a pair of spectacles, what does that mean? So if you're an adult, your productivity goes down. They say just by having access to a pair of spectacles, your productivity goes up about 30%. And your income earning capacity also goes up about 30%. So for corporates, whether there are firms having truck drivers, whether there are firms that does tailoring, whatever it is, I think it's, if you just get your workers to go, get your eyes checked and get a pair of spectacles, it's good for them, but also good for you because their productivity is going to go up and your firm is going to benefit. When it comes to children, they say 8 to 10% of children. Sorry, coming back to the adults, typically everybody above the age of 40, 45 would start needing reading glasses. They'll reach a stage where after 50, they really would struggle to read, especially when the light levels are a bit lower. When it comes to children, they say about 8% of children would need reading glasses. So we've done screening of more than 300,000 children, and that ratio is about correct. Now, if you don't do well in studies, often you drop out. In certain research, projects that have been done overseas, they say there is some correlation between juvenile crime and eyesight, because if you don't study well, what would then happen is you basically want to drop out and be up to some mischief. So I think, it's quite important. And there is also some data that shows that typically somebody who's been diagnosed and given a pair of spectacles would have at least one grade more. So this is more in the Western system where the studies have been done. So somebody who could have failed could have just passed. So in terms of, so there is a big, positive impact. And that's the reason why we are doing two major campaigns. One is called I See, I Learn for kids, and I See, I Work for adults. And, it's great that at least we can make a difference to a small segment, and we plan on building on it. The good part is many other organizations also doing it. And, as I had briefly mentioned before, hopefully by 2050, anyone who needs access to a pair of spectacles would get it.
Over to Ambassador Pradeep.
Thank you, Ameya. So, that has been very fascinating to listen to all the great work that you're doing. And it's very important work for, India and for other countries. Now, would you like to reflect upon your experience about, working in India, both in the eye care and with museums?
Yeah. See, I, within the museum sector, I'll make a very few quick points on the museum sector. India has got some of the best collections in the world. Probably any museum you go to, even a small portion of the collection would be a blockbuster exhibition anywhere in the world, whether you go to the Metropolitan Museum or you take a museum within the Smithsonian, they would love to get even 20, 30 objects. But our struggle often is the interpretation and the understanding of the audience and telling the story, as part of interpretation. All those things, are struggles. But again, that is not a struggle just, in India. You take, any non-Western part of the world, it's a similar thing. Whether you go to Indonesia, whether you go anywhere in the Pacific, it's the same thing. But there is now getting more, more interest from the sector to get better and better. The second thing is, I think we need to have a bit of a plan within the museum sector on how we could transform the sector. And the first aspect in the plan, I think especially with that kind of a government audience you have, is you cannot get a museum renewal happening in a museum just by getting somebody temporary there acting in that role for 6 months to a year. It takes minimum 8 to 10 years to do the transformation. So getting a professional to head it and getting the leadership in place is extremely, extremely important. You look at major museums in the world that have been through major countries. To give you a small example, a nearby country is Singapore. They've done that transformation over a 15 to 20 year period. So I think it's quite important that appointments are made, especially to our big museums. Long-term directors are appointed so that the leadership happens. The other aspect is we also have a dearth of human resources. Like I mentioned, in both the sectors I work in optometry or within the eye care sector in terms of testing, India has got hardly 1/3 the number of people it needs. Similarly, out here within the museum sector, based on my experience, I would imagine 80% of the people who are there don't have the skills yet. So it's quite important that that is also part of the whole museum renewal. Money is one thing, but I think the leadership part, so that somebody is there to take things at the helm and take it forward, and also to have the staff and others who can help in terms of doing this change, I think it's quite important. You can't rely on external consultants all the time. They can come and do some capital works, but after that, look, the ball's in your court, how you really take that forward. So this is what, and it's a great country. I think the systems are there. People complain about systems, but I think anywhere in the world, people would complain about systems. And I think it's just a question of just, understanding the system, working with the system. And we made fantastic progress in both these areas over a 10-year period. The very last, comment I'd give, especially to anyone international who's working in terms of working, on projects in India, give a slightly more longer time frame. Don't think that you can come in a year, make the change, and move on, kind of thing. It's taken us about 5 years to get it all really into a form where we can start performing better. And in 10 years, you'll be very happy, with what you've done. So whether it's transforming a museum or establishing an NGO internationally, especially in a place like India, give that time.
Thank you so much, Vinod. It has been such a fascinating life journey that you have traversed. And, after doing engineering from the premier institute in the country and in the world, you've gone on to, work in a totally different field, which is museums, and got so much of, understanding of this area and contributed so significantly in this field. And then you are doing such great work in the field of philanthropy in India, in eye care. So for a lot of IITians and others around the world, you're quite a role model. We thank you for absolutely the outstanding work you have done and for sparing your time today to share your life journey with us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your generous comments and for taking the time. So it's been a privilege to sit and have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Uh,
Over to you, Ameya.
we could have gone on and on, but the time is a factor. That brings me to the end of this program. I thank Mr. Vinod Daniel. He has joined us from Chennai today, and also Ambassador Pradeep Kapur. He has joined us from Washington. I think it's very late night there, so thank you for joining us from Washington. This is Sathaye signing off from New Delhi for SarkariTel.com and DiplomacyIndia.com.
Namaste.